let's talk about how to make money with your no-code app, how to monetize your app. Now, I could give you a bunch of surface level tips and techniques that seem a lot easier than they really are to implement, but if you've spent any time watching our videos, you know we like to be real with you. So today, we're going to break this down in depth and talk about not only the pricing models and pricing strategies you need to understand, but also what comes before that so that you can make sure you're charging or you're beginning to monetize your app at the right time. Because if you do this at the wrong time, then you're going to struggle to gain traction on the other side. So we're going to cover some of the fundamentals first, but make sure you stick around until the end because we're going to dive into those pricing models and pricing strategies afterwards. So if you're new around here, my name is Kristen and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help business owners and industry experts build custom apps to either start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding. So let's dive right in. Now, before we talk about the pricing models and the pricing strategies, I want to make sure that you're going through the correct stages so that you know when you should start monetizing your app in the first place, and to make sure that you're not jumping ahead too soon and getting stuck because of that. So we generally see two types of entrepreneurs who are deciding to build apps. Now, neither of these is right or wrong. These are just two types of people kind of coming into this scene and deciding to build an app for themselves. So the first type of person is someone who's building an app for maybe their own business or businesses like theirs. Maybe they're building an app for their own industry. So businesses in their industry, people in their industry, or they're building an app that solves a problem that they're really close to, or that is related to them somehow, that they know a lot about. Now, when this type of person is building an app, generally what we see is, number one, they have easy access to test or beta users because they're so close to this problem, or because it is related to their industry or even their own business. By default, they already have some users who they can reach out to in order to start testing their app, to move into those testing stages and do their beta testing and so on. And because of this, they usually move into the monetization, or they start generating that revenue a little bit earlier. Now, the other type of person or entrepreneur we see coming into the space and building a no-code app is someone who is creating an app based on just an idea they came up with. It might not really solve a specific problem. It's an idea that usually seems really cool or unique or different. And it's something that they just thought of throughout their day-to-day lives. Maybe something they did kind of sparked an idea. And this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this. This happens a lot, especially for really entrepreneurial-minded people who are always looking for or thinking of ideas. But with this type of entrepreneur who just has this idea, usually what happens with them is, number one, they don't have those kind of default users who they can reach out to for their app, because they might not even know who their users are going to be yet. Number one, they need to make sure that there's even a need for their app, and that's going to require them to figure out who their target market is, who would even want to use their app. They need to figure out what the app should even involve, what kind of features it should involve. So it's a lot different. Whereas that first person, they generally know exactly what features their app needs. They know the people who would be their users. They have a lot of this information. For this other type of entrepreneur who's coming in just with this idea, this cool idea they had, they're starting in a much different place. And it's important to understand this because sometimes that second type of entrepreneur who comes into this with a cool idea that they have, they try to jump forward too soon. And it leaves them either backtracking or feeling like their app idea just isn't good. But the problem is that that's often not the case. Often they have a really great app idea. They just didn't go through the initial stages correctly. And so they've run into a bunch of problems later on. So first, let's start with that entrepreneur. What do you need to do now in order to get to the point of being able to monetize your app? And then we're going to talk about the other type of entrepreneur. And then we're going to go into those pricing models and strategies. So for this entrepreneur who has this cool idea, if that's you, what you need to do first before you can start monetizing the app is you need to get that validation to make sure that there's a need for your app in the first place. Now, this can involve, market research, having conversations, and just talking to people to understand, whether or not people would want something like this, to kind of help yourself develop the product in your mind a little bit, or develop the idea in your mind a little bit. And things you can do to help with this are, number one, this might be the stage where you come up with a really quick prototype. Now, a prototype and an actual app, or a minimum viable product, an MVP, these are different things. When you're just creating a really simple prototype, this is generally just something to convey your idea. It's not going to be an actual working, customized, scalable product. You're not diving into that yet. You're creating something really quick just to convey an idea, to gauge interest in that idea, or gauge a need for that idea. So ways you might do this are creating a really simple landing page, for example, where you can just get email opt-ins for people who would be interested in hearing more about this. You can purchase a really basic template, a no-code template that will help just convey your idea. Maybe you make a couple tweaks to the language or the wording and so on, but you don't need to do a bunch of customization, because really you're just conveying that idea so that you can present it to people and get feedback, and make sure that you should then actually go into the stage where you're developing this full idea. Now, when you're doing this, you might want to create a landing page with a couple of different really basic functions to help convey this. You might want to, get that template and make a few tweaks just to convey that idea, for example, just to generate that feedback. So how do you do that? Well, fortunately, with no-code tools, this is easier than it otherwise could be. You're still going to have to do the work. You're still going to have to, put this all together, but you can do it relatively quickly. You can purchase a template, for example. You can learn how to really basically use a no-code tool. We use Bubble specifically. You can learn the very fundamentals of Bubble just to make a few tweaks and get something up and running, just to get some quick feedback on it. You can go through a course, for example, to learn some of those fundamentals. You can go through something like, a boot camp, for example, that teaches you some really basic fundamentals just to get that really quick prototype up and running, so that you can just convey your idea. And I say up and running, but I'm talking like something really basic, just to make sure that you should be building the app in the first place. Now, when you do this, you're still going to have to invest some work up front. You can invest some money up front by, going through a course, getting a template so that you can help yourself move quickly. You're not going to have to spend all that much money on it. You're going to be able to do it really quickly. In this case, the quality is not going to be high, right? The quality of that prototype, because you're not actually building something that you're planning to scale. You're just building something that you want to validate. Now, once you've done that, you can now kind of catch up to where that other entrepreneur is. Okay, so that's who we're going to talk about now, because they are one really big step closer to monetizing their app. So when you're in the position of this second entrepreneur, where they have that validation. Now this entrepreneur has that easy validation. They're solving a problem in their business, their industry, a problem that they themselves deal with. They don't necessarily need to go through that prototype phase because they already have this validation. They can simply talk to their business's team. They can talk to other businesses like theirs. They can talk to their colleagues, their coworkers, people in their industry. They can go off their own needs for the problem that they're solving, and so on. So they're a really big step ahead. Now, what this entrepreneur has to do in order to start generating that revenue is, instead of building that quick prototype, they need to build their product, their actual product. So whereas, that first entrepreneur is building a prototype to get idea validation, the second entrepreneur is building a product to get product validation. Now, this isn't validation on whether or not the product is needed. That goes back to the idea validation. This is validation on how the product should be built and how the product should be evolved. We know there's a need for the product. Okay, we already have these default users who we can start taking that product to. That's when we can start generating that revenue. But we need to build the product, and we need to prepare it for them, and we need to prepare it to be scalable so that you can actually start generating that revenue and you don't run into a bunch of hiccups down the road that we're going to talk about. So when you're building a product, this is your minimum viable product. So you still want to build a core product. You don't want to go too far. You don't want to build out that full product, because remember, we're still looking for validation here. It's just in a different way. Now we're validating all the little nuances of the product that we already know is needed. Okay, so when you're building a product, when you're building this MVP, you want to make sure that you are, number one, building it correctly, because this isn't something that you are just using to convey an idea. This is something that you're going to start bringing users onto. It needs to be optimized for things like performance. It needs to be secure. It needs to be scalable, because you are going to be turning this into a business. You're going to either be using it to grow your existing business or to scale it into a business of its own. So we're looking at product validation here. You get that product up and running, you bring your initial users on board immediately, and you start getting feedback to help you refine that product. This is more so when you start looking at charging for that product. So in this stage, you can still move through that stage where you're creating that core product quickly. It's not going to be as quick as the prototype, obviously, because you are customizing this product. You're creating something that's optimized and scalable. It's niche to your specific market, industry, business, and so on. So, your speed, it can still be fast if you're following the right process. This is going to depend on how you approach it, obviously, whether you kind of wing it throughout or if you do choose to follow some sort of a process. You're going to spend a little bit more money on this, assuming that this is more of an investment for you and that you are, looking at this as a scalable business or something that you're going to scale into a business. But when you're in this stage, you want your quality to be a lot higher. You want to be building this core product so that when you do start bringing those users on, you can actually start generating that revenue, because you don't want to, bring the users on, start charging them, and then have a product that just doesn't work or doesn't scale. It's not optimized. It gives them a poor experience. And then you are left going back and rebuilding the product while they are stuck on the original product or just kind of in limbo with no product at all. That's not the route you want to go down. So those are kind of the initial stages. Now, I know we're talking about making money with your no-code apps, and I know we just covered a lot of the basics here. But the reason is because I want to make sure you know what stage you're in. If you're in that idea validation stage, you now need to get to that product validation stage. Okay, but if you're in the product validation stage, you're building that core product, then you can start thinking about monetization and about growing that revenue. Okay, so now Now that you know which stage you're in and when you should be moving into the monetization, that's what we're going to talk about. So what I'm going to do first is share my screen, and we're going to jump over to the whiteboard here so that we can talk through and draw through some of these strategies and tactics here. So we're going to look at this on a spectrum, and we're going to talk about different pricing models and different pricing strategies. So if we're looking at this on a spectrum, and we're looking at price point for your app, and this is going to help you decide where on the spectrum you should land. On the left side over here, we're going to say we have the most expensive apps, or the highest price point apps. And on the right over here, we're going to have the cheapest apps. Okay, so the ones that are going to be at that lowest price point. And then in the middle here, we're going to have a kind of an in-between stage. There we go. Right there. So first, how do you figure out where you should be and kind of what you should be charging for your app? Well, on the left side here, we generally see apps that are kind of almost like services in and of themselves. So here's an example of that. We have a client named Piers, and he was already running a successful business where he was helping other businesses grow and kind of streamline their own operations. Right? He was already running a successful business doing that without having an app. But he wanted to add on another revenue stream for his business. And so he decided to create an app that still applied to the businesses he was already serving, but it allowed him to kind of package his existing services in a new, more scalable way. Now, if you are in this category, you're likely experiencing something similar. Maybe you already have a business, but you want to scale further. You want to, maybe you are kind of capped out on your capacity, where the only way to grow your business is to either just, spend more time or hire more team members, for example, and kind of grow into an agency. But instead, you want to build an app, because that, you can start serving on a one-to-many model instead of a more one-on-one model. Okay, so in this case, we find that the apps themselves are either really close to those services, those existing business services, or they're kind of a transition of those services. So maybe they work hand in hand with the service, they go right along with it, or maybe they're kind of replacing it. Okay, but it's still a higher price point. Generally, for apps on this side of the spectrum, you aren't going to have as many users, or sometimes you might even just refer to these as your clients, because they might be existing clients. So you're going to have fewer users, and I'm talking about your direct users for your app. Your users might have many end users. For example, Piers, he has a smaller group of immediate users because he's serving his clients in a more custom way. It's more catered to their business. It's more of a service. But those clients who are using his app, they have lots of end users. So while his app might have thousands and thousands and thousands of users, he is working directly with only a small group of his actual clients. Okay, so you might be in the same position. Now, if this is you, or if you're on this side, you're generally going to be looking at more high ticket service offerings. So maybe your clients, for example, are paying you an upfront, more high ticket fee in the thousands, 5,000, 10,000 more, per year, or just initially for this service. But you're definitely looking at a more high ticket solution here. Now, this could be an upfront fee or an upfront payment for an initial setup, for example, for initial services. And then you could move to a retainer afterwards, where there might be a monthly retainer or an annual retainer, for example. So again, on this end of the spectrum, this is more so for business-focused apps. You're generally working directly with clients. You're charging at a much higher price point. You have fewer direct users. You can still have more end users, but you're going to be at that much higher price point. Now, on the opposite side, we're looking at apps that are much more generalized. These are general apps that serve a wide market of people, of users. And on this side, you're going to have many users. The reason being, if you're charging at a really low price point, you need a much larger user base to generate a decent revenue with your app. On the other end, you don't really need very many users if you're charging at this really high price point. But on this end, you're going to need a large pool of users to really start making good money with your app. Now, your app is going to be more general because it is appealing to a larger market base. And with these types of apps, we often see things like freemium models. Now, this is where, maybe the app starts out as free, but in order to access certain features, you have to pay for an upgrade, for example. They might be subscription-based apps, where you're just charging a really low subscription fee per month, maybe per year. You might even be monetizing the app via ads. Now, in this case, the app itself might be free to use, but for that free use, you're showing the users ads, and you're making money based on those ads. You need a large user base to really make a good income from that or generate a good revenue from that. These can also be one-time purchases or one-time fees, where you just pay a really low fee one time and then you can use the app from there on out. So neither of these sides of the spectrum is right or wrong. There are tons and tons of apps that can fall anywhere on this spectrum. On this right side of the spectrum, for example, we have a client named Alex who is creating a health-related app, and it appeals to a much larger market, any more general market than our client peers who would be on the opposite end of the spectrum. Neither is right or wrong. This is just the direction that they're going. But again, on this end, on the right end, where you're charging that low price point, you're going to have to generate a larger user base to build up that revenue with your app. Now, right in the middle here, and again, we can have apps that fall anywhere on this spectrum, but right in the middle, you'll find lots of apps that are kind of like SaaS products, for example. So software as a service, where you're using a platform, maybe in your business, you're using it consistently. Maybe you're using it daily to run certain business operations, for example. This doesn't have to be business related, but you usually find that you might find this with certain project management tools or productivity tools or things like that. Okay, so you're using the app on an ongoing basis. Usually these are going to be a little bit more niche. Think of things like email marketing platforms. You have things like MailChimp, which is really basic. It serves a wider market because it's really general and it's more basic, but it's niched down enough that you're using MailChimp generally for business purposes to send business emails. But then you have platforms like Infusionsoft or Keep, and that's much, much, much more robust, and it serves a really specific audience within that same kind of category. So the different types of apps here can differ, but that's the type of app that we're usually looking at. Now, an example of this would be our client, Brian, who he built an app to help physical businesses run their business operations on a day-to-day basis. Now, because this is something that they use consistently in their business daily, this is something that you would choose a pricing model that is probably something like a subscription fee. So a monthly subscription, maybe an annual subscription. You might even do this on a contract basis, depending on your app, your market, who you serve, and so on. The other type of kind of model you might see here, and you've probably seen this before, is more like a per task fee. So maybe the app itself is free to use, but the volume at which you use it dictates how much you pay. So maybe it's free, at a certain level, but then once you use it so much, you have to start paying. So Zapier, for example, you can use Zapier for free, but once you run a certain number of zaps per month, then you have to start paying. For example, you'll see this with some email service providers too. You can send a certain number of emails for free. Once you reach a certain point, you start paying for each email you send. A really small fee, but if you're using this in a business setting, usually it's going to add up. So those are kind of the pricing models you can look at when you're in this in-between section with your app. Okay, now to be clear, there's not one blanket statement for every type of app. So you don't have to try to fit yourself directly into one of these. You're not limited, but I just want to give you a general overview of what we generally see and what might be the easiest tactics for you to go with. Now, on this side of the spectrum here, we typically see B2C apps. So these are apps that are being created directly for consumers. Okay, so again, you're reaching that wider market. The app is going to be a little bit more general. You need more users because the app is at a lower price point. So you need that larger user base to generate that revenue. Now, on this side, we usually see more B2B apps. So these are apps that are being created specifically for businesses. So again, we're looking at that higher price point or those higher ticket services that might be bundled with an app, or an app that's kind of taking over those original business services, for example, those higher priced or higher tiered or more niche down and customized SaaS products, for example. So these are going to be more B2B. So this should give you a really good overview of where your app might fall, because we've covered a lot of different factors and aspects here. The user base size, who your market is, whether that's other businesses or whether that's direct to consumers, the different price points, the different examples of apps that you might find on any, one point of this spectrum. But there are a couple other things I want to go over in terms of pricing, and more specifically, in terms of your revenue and your profit margins and what you can expect depending on where on this spectrum you yourself land. So over on this left side, where we have those apps that are a higher price point, right? We have the fewer users. These are going to be more B2B apps. What you're going to find is that these apps are going to generate for you a higher revenue, okay? Your revenue is going to be higher naturally because you're charging a lot more, okay? Now, keep in mind that when you're operating an app that's kind of like a service, generally your profit margins, right, are going to be a little bit lower. Now, the reason for this is because this type of app is generally more catered to each individual client or immediate user use serve. So you are likely working one-on-one with your clients or your customers in this capacity. You might be including other services alongside this app, right? This app might kind of come in combination with those services. And so you're going to need to spend more time on this. You're generally going to need a larger team to handle this, to handle the fulfillment. Now, having an app is going to allow you to increase that capacity and not have to hire as many team members in order to make that higher revenue. But the profit margins are going to be generally, again, no blanket statement here, but generally a little bit lower because you're going to have to start thinking about the more customized fulfillment that you're going to be going through and just the amount of time that you're going to be spending with each individual client. Now, on the other side here, where we have those lower cost apps, we have that larger user base. Generally, these are going to be more B2C apps. What you're going to find is usually initially upfront, your revenue, right? So your revenue is going to be lower up front because you're going to have to spend time growing that larger user base. Now, you can do this in a couple of different ways. You can invest your money in marketing, in running ads, and you can grow your user base that way. Whichever way you do this, you can go through the organic traffic route, the cold outreach route, however you want to do this. Initially, your revenue is going to be lower because you have to spend time doing that. You have to get to that larger user base in order to really start generating that higher revenue level. But generally, again, no blanket statement, but generally, your profit on the other side of this, right? Once you have that user base, your profit margins are usually going to be a little bit higher because the app is more generalized. That means that you're not catering to each specific user or each specific client. Your app is usually, when you make updates, it's not going to be one-on-one client focused. It's going to be app wide. And because you have a wider market that's more generalized, you can make these more broad updates that can apply to everybody. So, it's a little bit less niche. It's a little bit easier in terms of management. You're not going to be looking at all those costs for fulfillment that you might see on the other end of this spectrum. And so generally, if you do this really well, your profit margins are usually going to be a little bit higher on the other side of this, right? Once you have that user base. All right, so we've covered a lot here. And the next thing you need to ask yourself is, what do you need to do right now? What is your next step towards diving into these tactics and these strategies and really starting to monetize your app? Well, this is going to go back to those initial 2 stages that we talked about, right? Either validating your idea and making sure there's a need for it, or starting to build out that scalable product, making sure it's optimized, making sure that it really can support those initial users that you're going to bring on board. You got to figure out which one of those that you're in. Now, if you're in that initial idea validation stage, then you can start thinking about these different monetization strategies right now, but you're not going to want to jump straight into them yet, because you don't want to find yourself skipping too far ahead, running into these obstacles, and then having to backtrack, okay? You don't want to jump right into developing out your full product yet. You need to just start with making sure there's a need for your app, okay? If you know there's a need for your app, right? If you're that type of person who you're building an app that solves a problem in your industry, maybe your business, maybe it solves a problem that you yourself have, there's a need, generally which core features are needed, you have a really good base from where you're starting. Now you just need to kind of develop that product so that you can start bringing on those test users and start charging, right? So when you start testing your app, that's usually when you start monetizing it, when you start bringing those beta users on board. There are lots of different ways that you can do this, more than we can cover in one video because we've already covered a ton here. But know that, when you're in that product validation stage where you're just getting that core product up and running, you're one step away from being able to start monetizing it. You just have to get that step right so that it's going to support your users and support that scale as you start monetizing and as you start growing from there. So those are kind of your next steps. Either validate your idea or get that product built and then move into this monetization and start getting those later stages of feedback, expanding your app, fine-tuning the pricing, and so on. Now, if you're in the stage where you need to just build the right product so that you can get to the point of monetizing your app, and you want our help, we take a small group of entrepreneurs who are in that specific stage. They know there's a need for their app. Now they need to build their product, build it correctly in an optimized way so that it is scalable. If you're in that stage and you want our help, we take this small group of entrepreneurs through a 12-week process where we take them from having this idea that they know they need to build out to having their minimum viable product that they can start testing. If you want to learn more about that, you can head to coachingnocodeapps.com/apply. You can schedule a free strategy call. You can send over a few details about what you're trying to accomplish, and we can see if we can help you get there. So again, head to coachingnocodeapps.com/apply, and we can start the conversation from there. All right. I know we went through a lot today. I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.